Please join me in welcoming to the stage Mark Cutifani.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, it is a great privilege to be here to talk to you today. I'd like to start by picking up 3 points to define the nature of the conversation. I gave a presentation in Brazil about 6 weeks ago. And one of the things that struck me in giving the presentation, and it was about collaborative research in our industry, which has all but died, but I think needs to be resuscitated because, quite frankly, as an industry, we're failing society. And so I'm there advocating for a much more collaborative approach because I think as an industry, if we don't get together with our colleagues across the globe, the world has some serious problems and we're going to have to be part of that debate. But in the context of Australia, there were 3 key points I wanted to make. The great tax debate seems to have taken on a life of its own in this country, but it's also an issue across the globe. And for me, it's becoming a metaphor for all things we as an industry can't seem to get right in terms of our relationships with local communities, governments, and our broader social stakeholders. The second point I'd make, in this complex landscape, now is not the time for industry leaders to claim the right to develop without full consideration of the challenges we need to face as a country together. It is also a challenging time for our country, and so in this environment, now is not the time for politicians to define the nature of our differences in terms of class and privilege. Now let me start my conversation with an African perspective, and I think in many ways it starts to put our position as a country, as a provider of resources to the world, in context. Now the world is growing at a rate of around 2.5% to 3%. This growth is powered by the expectations and growth in China, in India, in the Asian tigers, the Eastern Bloc, Russia, South America, and to that we can add the lions of Africa. And for us as an industry to serve the needs of the world and society, we can't keep going on a business as usual basis. Let me give you 7 reasons why Australia should be very scared of Africa in that context. Africa is home to 40% of the world's natural resources, which includes water, sources of energy and commodities. Africa has the world's quickest growing population, with the current population of 1 billion likely to exceed 2 billion by 2025 at the earliest, and probably 2030 at the latest. Africa has the world's best age demographic. It will have more people of working age in 2025 than India or China. 7 of the world's fastest growing economies are in Africa. The most recent example of an emerging economic transformation is Sierra Leone, growing at 45% thanks to the development of iron ore related infrastructure and project developments. The great news for Sierra Leone is that the infrastructure is understood by social leaders and those that are developing those assets, and so they understand that the agricultural industry, secondary industry, services industry will also benefit from those developments, and they're working with each other as partners to understand how that growth or those project developments can benefit the country. African economies are amongst the least leveraged in the world, and they are only now starting to wake to their own development potential. Africa's labour costs are extremely low by any standards, leaving lots of room to rapidly increase economic participation of a large proportion of the population. And finally, Africa is rapidly democratising and establishing new governance standards that make a simple statement. That statement is, Africa is open for business. I have heard it said that this will be the Asian century. I think they're wrong. There is no Asian century without Africa. This will be the Asian-African century, and certainly in the second half of this century, many will argue that it is in fact the African century. Apart from iron ore, Australia risks becoming an economic footnote through the course of this century if it continues on the self-destruction of its mining industry. In fact, as a global mining industry, we have a much bigger problem to address, with Africa being a key to all our futures. At a time when we need to most effectively utilise and develop our natural resources to support global growth and prosperity, we are facing challenges that we've not yet found answers to. In the context of this global growth, which really is a manifestation of the expectations of the emerging economies of the world, we face chronic shortfalls in potable and clean water. The world is 40% short clean water, clean and efficient energy sources, and commodities and raw materials necessary to support that development. Our sad reality is both community and the natural resource industry leadership have been unwitting collaborators in this failure to position the natural resources industry to serve society in the manner in which is desperately needed. To be clear, our community leaders have failed us, as we in the natural resources industry are left to navigate rules and barriers that effectively limit practical access to significant areas of resource potential. We have to navigate complex legislative frameworks that are often contradictory and deliver marginal value in terms of delivering environmental friendly outcomes, and short-sighted taxation frameworks that act to discourage investments in the development of natural resource projects, efficient natural resource projects. But at the same time, as industry leaders, we have also been architects of our own uncertain destiny. Advocacy efforts have failed to position our industry in the forefront of community thinking regarding our role in creating a sustainable future. Our development models have largely ignored the specific needs of local and broader regional communities, further constraining our ability to develop and grow our businesses. We have failed to develop our operating models consistent with progress made across other industrial and thought-leading sectors. The industry has fractured and lost its collective voice in the face of short-term political point scoring, and I make this as a global observation, and I'll bring my observations to a more local context. But the conversations we're having in Australia is no different to the conversations we're having in many of our jurisdictions across the world. However, in the context of Africa, Australia is now presenting a wonderful opportunity for us as a continent to demonstrate why we will outgun the rest of the mining industry, and I'm talking about the rest of the globe, over the next 30 to 50 years. So before I go further, let me share with you a few numbers that I threw out with my Brazilian colleagues, and we had a few NGOs in the room, that triggered a few interesting questions at the end of the discussion. Firstly, the mining industry on a global basis contributes 11.5% of the world's GDP, and that's as measured by revenues across the globe, as measured by revenues in terms of the products we produce. The estimated indirect contribution, which is including service industries that support our industry, brings that global GDP contribution to somewhere between 21 and 23% of global GDP. And if we then include products like fertilisers for agriculture, building materials in terms of construction and infrastructure building, fuel for transport, the mining industry drives at least 45% of the world's GDP. Now, at the same time, let's put our environmental credentials on the table. The mining industry disturbs less than 1% of the Earth's surface in terms of our mining activities. The mining industry consumes less than 1% of the world's potable water, while at the same time, the products of mining are absolutely critical in providing and cleaning water for communities to survive in today's world, at least adding 10% of available water in terms of that context. Mining generates less than 3% of the world's carbon gases, while providing products that have reduced net carbon gas emissions in the agricultural sector alone by 15%. Now, as we say in Wollongong, if you're invited to a knife fight, make sure you bring a gun. Now, if we're going to have an argument about the value of mining in terms of the globe, let's use the facts. And let's make sure everybody understands how important we are as an industry. And I think Australians get that message, but maybe they don't understand that the road outside this wonderful establishment, mining's contribution to the construction of that road is arguably 45%, certainly at least 20% in terms of the revenues from mining and the jobs that we create as a consequence of our activities in this country. And I'm not sure Australians get that. Certainly Australians that live and work in Sydney, I don't think necessarily get that point. Without mining and the products of mining, we could only feed and support less than 50% of the world's population. You only have to go and look at fertilisers and the products we produce in terms of mechanised agricultural methods, what contribution we're making to feeding the populations of the world. But one would think that a few bad actors in the industry have created a reputation for us as an industry no different to a few bad eggs from Wollongong football teams travelling around the country on their end-of-year football trips. Yes, absolutely league, not union players, although I will have to apologise to Dubbo and the Dubbo Rugby Club for some of my behaviours back many years ago. We need a new conversation. We need to land a new conversation. We have to take responsibility. I think it's unfair to expect certain individuals in this country and certain high-profile individuals to carry the arguments that we all have to carry to the public. And whilst I have no issues with the Clive Palmers and the Gina Rineharts, they've done extremely well, they've taken risks, and they've been successful. But at the end of the day, the people in this room are the people that really characterise what our industry is about, and the people that work on mine sites are what characterise our industry. And we need to hear from the people in this room, people like myself, people who are working across the industry making a difference. We need to hear all of our voices in this debate, and we all have to be part of the conversation. So I have three issues that I'd like to pick up in terms of the points I want to make. Three key points. First, define the problem. Second, I'd like to define what I don't think the answer is. And as part of that, talk about leadership. And third, to explore what an answer might look like in terms of those debates. So, firstly, I think we're looking down the gun barrel. We must help community leaders understand that the rising tide on commodity prices is not a function of some altruistic God that favours miners. It reflects an industry in crisis, an industry that is struggling to meet the demands that are being placed on it by society. And for those that understand our industry, there are 5 things driving costs that are steepling at more than 10 to 15% a year. Increasing depths, around 40 to 50 metres a year. Reducing grades, which reflect the quality of the deposits we're mining and the fact that we're not bringing new deposits in. Reduced access to land, and for those prospects that we are developing are further away from infrastructure. Increased exploration costs. We're spending 3 times the amount we were spending 15 years ago, and we're finding less. And the high intensity use of commodities themselves, energy and commodities, is driving our price up more than 3 to 5% a year. So on average, we're seeing costs escalate more than 10%, up near 15% a year. And here's a couple of more frightening statistics. It is estimated by Caterpillar that in the next 10 years we will have to mine 70% more open pit material to mine the same metals we're mining today. On average, underground operations that are operating today will be 400 to 600 metres deeper than they are today, a function of the natural depth increase that we'll see over time. These are the pressures that we're all under. That's the crisis we face as an industry, and that's the crisis we face as a society. The costs of our products will probably more than double in the next 5 to 10 years due to those statistics. I'm not sure the community understands, but what's a bigger worry is I'm not sure the industry leadership actually understands those numbers and has put in place plans and strategies to deal with that crisis. And if we haven't got our heads around those numbers, what hope is there for politicians and other leaders in our industry? We know we have to lobby for access and work in terms of investment research. For those that weren't aware of it, the mining industry spends 0.2% of its revenues on research and development. And for an industry that's in crisis, an industry where its products will more than double in price over the next 10 years at best, one would think there's not a problem. And what's worse, because we can't articulate what the challenge is, we've got politicians putting in place more costs, more structures that will reduce availability and the extraction of resources necessary to support those global developments. We've got a crisis on a crisis. And at the end of the day, we first have to look in the mirror in terms of how we deal with that. Now, I would say that in terms of the things that from an industry perspective, the things we haven't done, we haven't trained and developed the skills necessary to support our current growth pipeline. The mining industry remains desolate in terms of progressive mining management processes. We remain 20 years behind the manufacturing sector in many instances. And to be fair, there are those that are implementing progressive and new approaches, but in the main, we're well behind where we should be. On research and development, 0.2% against 3 to 5% in the petroleum industry. And many of our relationships with local communities still resemble the paternalistic models of the 19th century. Now, at this point, I'd acknowledge Andrew Forrest for the great speech he gave to the National Press Club on Indigenous training. I thought it was a great piece, and all power to Andrew and the organisation. I think that was a great speech, and for anybody that hasn't seen a copy of that speech, I'd commend it to anybody, and quite frankly, I think you could apply it to any jurisdiction across the world. It was a great piece, and all power to Andrew. I was really proud of what he put together. You may scoff at South Africa, but what country in the world has a tripartite document called the Mining Charter that commits government, industry and its organised labour organisations to a 30% growth in the industry, which also spells out a social compact, which also spells out training commitment, which also spells out commitment to research and development and transformation from the horrors of apartheid that we still live with today. At the end of the day, it's been a tough conversation, but we are, as far as I'm aware, the only jurisdiction in the world that has a compact, that has a strategy with its government in terms of changing the fortunes of its mining industry around. We've got to come off a low base in terms of investment, but in the next 2 to 3 years, you will see South Africa roar back with a very loud voice. So, in talking about defining what's possible, I think there are 3 critical interventions. We must advocate for our industry with a new voice, and every one of us has a responsibility to advocate for the industry. How we can articulate and message our points so that the public understands what we contribute in and as part of every aspect of society is the job that every one of us shares. How many people understand that we touch less than 1% of the Earth's surface, yet drive 45% of the world's GDP? When I said that, the head of Oxfam US said, "I could not believe the numbers. How come that hasn't been talked about?" I said, the one thing we don't do very well as an industry is talk about what we do. And even if it's as simple as talking about what we do, that's what we've got to do. The resource curse is about a number of things. It is not a manifestation of the mining of natural resources, and I've heard politicians talk about Australia's version of the resource curse. The resource curse is a manifestation of narrow industry development strategies and narrow political leadership and associated governance structures. At the end of the day, and every one of us in this room in developing a new project has to think about 80% of the people that we touch in terms of our developments, and how 80% of the people can see direct benefits from the things we do. And I use a little case in Guinea where when we invest in a new project, about 10% of the local population get jobs, another 10% get jobs through the services industry. The other 80%, what they see, a hole in the ground, dust, 1 out of 5 of their colleagues getting to spend and purchase goods and services that they can't afford. They see the cost of goods and services going up, and they say, well, why the hell would we want to support a mine in our backyard when 80% of the local population don't benefit? What we're now rethinking is how do we invest in that community, and we put extra money for power, extra money for roads, extra money for commercial infrastructure and other infrastructure like health that benefits 80% of that community. And for us it means a 10 to 15% difference in terms of our capital spends. But in terms of what we get to do with our local communities, it saves us 20% in terms of costs and support from the locals. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you're building something in the Pilbara or in a back room or small local community in Guinea, that's the approach we have to go with. There are lots of things I could go through with, but if I could end in terms of defining a different approach. One point: where is the Australian government's blueprint for the development of the future Australia? Where is the mining industry's proposal in terms of how it can support the development of the future Australia? I would argue that the country needs to understand what it did well in the last 20-odd years, 25 years, through both Liberal and Labor governments. In the last 6 years, the country's mining industry has dropped productivity by 30%. And at the same time, we're paying the highest wages in the world. The Australian industry cannot afford to continue down that path. We cannot afford to disengage with the government. We have to come together. So I think the first thing we have to do is make sure that people understand we're not an extractive industry. We're not about going to the dentist. We are a development industry, and we are about developing the potential of Australia, both in terms of its own population and the populations of the world. Where is that development blueprint for Australia? It's time we got out there and advocated for at least a development summit, so that our industry and other industries can start talking about and dealing with the problems that we confront on a constructive basis, and we need to do that together. The investment in open access transport infrastructure. We have to stop arguing about who can use whose infrastructure. At the end of the day, it should be for all of us to develop and make sure that the country itself benefits from the things that we develop. How can we leverage the mining industry in helping us deal with water challenges that we face in so many of our farming and regional communities? In Mali, we've built 7 dams. We can now actually farm 365 days a year as a consequence of the mining developments in that country. Dealing with chronic skills shortages looks like something the government and the industry could do far more in terms of collaboration. If we have an east-west mismatch in skills, why wouldn't we be encouraging and supporting remobilisation of current skills? Bleeding our regional development centres through the revenue base that is directly paying for, as I said, 30 to 50% of the roads outside this door. While I have many lawyer friends, I don't expect we'll have a sustainable lawyer-led economic growth that takes us forward for the next 30 to 40 years. We are part and parcel of the future of Australia. We need to advocate for a new future, and we need to push for a development summit so we can connect with all parts of the community and drive the country forward. Because quite frankly, we're not seeing the leadership in many other places. That's what we've got to do. We've got to stand up and lead. In the context of recalibrating Australia and the need to create a new vision for the country, why wouldn't we be promoting that development summit? We need to reflect on where we have come from, what we've achieved, and why we are and believe we will remain the lucky country. As we know from history, the building of the Snowy Mountains Power Scheme, the Ord River Project, the Kalgoorlie Water Pipeline, the creation of the lucky country wasn't about luck. We need to rebuild our vision, of what the country can and how it will develop so that our children can still talk about living in that lucky country. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said earlier, you can't take Wollongong out of the boy. I still call Australia home, and it will always be that way. My passion for the debate is not about scoring points from politicians, from industry leaders, or even my friends back in Wollongong. I'm a father to 7 kids. Some of those kids live here in Australia and some live in South Africa. But in all likelihood, most of them will spend most of their lives in this country. I'm committed to making sure I do my best to make Australia a better place for them and their children. To do anything less would be a betrayal of my responsibility to their future. If we are to be true to the leadership as an industry that we provide for our communities, the conversation around a new future and our commitment to that future must start with us here, and it must start today. Thank you.